The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Education is a major industry in the United States, and Troy University is part of this industry. Economic statistics provide plenty of evidence that education is valuable. But why does education create value? It turns out that economics offers two main explanations for the value of education, and which one holds has significant implications for the education industry and public policy. Economist Bryan Caplan from George Mason University argues in his provocatively titled 2008 book, The Case Against Education, that the evidence suggests that much of what you might think you know about education is mistaken. Professor Caplan earned his PhD from Princeton University and is the author of 4 books, dozens of economic papers, and he currently blogs at EconLog. Today, he's going to tell us about the theory of labor market signaling and its significant implications for public policy. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me.
So, let's get started with we both work in this education industry, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it's a significant industry, and just to be clear, although your book is titled The Case Against Education, you're not saying that education doesn't help create value in society.
Sometimes it does, once in a while.
Or that there's no return to education.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of evidence that going to school will help you get a better job, make more money, open up doors. So plenty of evidence of that.
And so as people get more educated, with a high school degree as opposed to not having a high school degree, or when they get a bachelor's degree opposed to no bachelor's degree, they earn more money, and firms are willing to pay them this money. So at some level, the firms find more educated workers more valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite right.
And it extends beyond just earnings, right? There are other labor market outcomes that
Sure, such as the unemployment rate.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so not only do workers, more educated people earn more money, but they're also less likely to lose their job and have got better outcomes as well. So if you were to ask, if some 17-year-old was asking you, should they go to college, your response would be?
Well, my first question would be, well, how have you been doing in high school? Because one of the biggest problems with college is that a high percentage of students who start don't finish. And almost all of the financial payoff and career payoff comes from finishing. And it's not that random. It's actually quite predictable. People who did very well in high school have high rates of graduation and generally graduate in a timely manner. On the other hand, people who did poorly in high school, when they have low rates of graduation, and if they do finish, it takes them a long time. So I'd say that's the first question. Yeah. And really, like just in terms of your own career, I would say, unless you're in the top third or quarter of your high school class, then I think that actually college is a bad idea for you, because you're so unlikely to actually get to the finish line and get that bag of money that waits for you over the finish line.
And you raise a good point that you can't look at these averages for everybody who's there, because that person who's struggling to try to finish college probably isn't going to earn the average earnings of all college graduates, right?
That's right. So again, like the optimistic scenario would be, sure, college isn't for everyone, but the people who go benefit and the people who don't wouldn't benefit. And I say actually it's worse than that. I say a lot of the people who try right now don't benefit. And again, and not just because they had some bad luck, but primarily because a reasonable person would have advised them, this isn't for you. This is going to be too hard, given the fact that your academic performance suggests you're not going to do well. And of course, no prediction is perfectly accurate, but if you've been in the bottom quarter of math performance in high school, the odds that you'll ever finish a college degree in anything, much less something that requires math, is super low.
So economics offers two different views as like how we could explain this college or this education premium. So Tell us what these views are, and then we'll get into each of them in a little bit more detail.
Right, so the first is the one that you've heard throughout your entire life, usually called human capital. This says that you go into school and they pour skill into you. So you show up, you're an unskilled child, and you spend many years having the skill poured into you, and then when you finish, you are now a skilled adult. So that's one story, and it's not completely wrong. Schools do teach some skills that you're likely to use in the job. So they teach literacy, numeracy, useful skills. But the other story, called signaling, says that there's something else important going on, and this is that you are getting a stamp on your forehead. Stamp saying a grade A worker, grade B worker, grade C worker. And this story says even if what you're studying in school is not useful in the real world, and in point of fact, a lot of what you study in school you will never use again after the final exam. It's just so impractical. When are you going to use history or Shakespeare or even foreign language for the most part? When are you going to use French in the American economy? So even though a lot of this stuff is not actually going to be useful on the job, it still opens doors. And the signaling story says it opens doors because the fact that you did well in these otherwise useless classes is a good way to convince employers, to persuade employers that you are the kind of person that will be a good worker, because if you can do well in school, you can learn this whatever stuff that they make you learn there, you'll probably also do well on the job.
So economists use this term human capital, and we're really trying to draw the parallel to like physical capital.
Yeah.
And so we think of the example of like a firm investing and building a factory, and then at the end of building a factory, now we can be more productive because we have all these tools to complement our labor. We use this same analogy for this term human capital. That's how economists came up with it, right?
Yes, and again, and there's nothing wrong with the idea of human capital. Like workers, like workers who are trained to do something, they've got some human capital, they got some skill. But then the question is, how much, to what extent does the education cause the skill, and how much rather is it just a way of persuading employers that you're worthy of being given a chance? And, the way that I think about it is that in the signaling model, education is basically a passport to the real training, and the real training happens on the job, right? And that's really the main thing that I think is going on, is that people go to school not to actually get prepared for real life directly, but so you get a piece of paper, that diploma, which then makes employers say, okay, it's worth giving this person some actual practical training.
And so labor market signaling, tell us a little bit about some of the because this was what I think one of the real counter and non-intuitive, when you think about, or you just like think about the economic growth, this is one of those things that it's not immediately obvious how this is going to work, but some of the economists who came up with this idea have done very well. They won Nobel Prizes for this work, right?
All right, yeah. So Michael Spence won a Nobel Prize for his work on educational signaling specifically, and a bunch of other economists, like Kenneth Arrow, Joe Stiglitz, have done work on this. The big difference between my book and all those guys is those guys are theorists. Those guys are writing down a theoretical model where this could be true. And this is a book where I say, no, not could be true. It is true. It is the main story of what's going on. Signaling is the model that explains how you can spend so much time in school studying subjects that you're never going to use again, and yet employers care. That's the weird thing. Employers care if you fail history or you fail French. And like, when am I going to use French on this job? What difference does it make? And the answer is, when you do poorly in school, it makes employers nervous about giving you a chance.
So explain for us then, in your take, what is it that employers are really interested in prospective employees?
Yeah, so I say there's three general things, right, that for virtually any job. So first of all, they're looking for workers who are smart, right? And that's one thing that school helps filter out, is people who aren't so smart, because it's easy for smart people to do calculus, and people who aren't so smart, it's really hard for them, right? And then I think like work ethic. So they want to get people that are, will actually go and work a lot of hours and keep it up and that kind of thing. And then the third thing, though, I say is that they're looking for conformity. It's not enough to be smart or even hardworking if you're just a defiant, difficult, non-team player. People like that are not good employees. They're fun people. I know people that they're smart, they're determined, but they are defiant. And so, yeah, great hanging out with them, but I don't want to hire them for my business because they're going to be arguing all the time. And look, there is no I in team. Business is about cooperating with other people, getting along with the customer. And so I say, actually, this conformity is especially important because there are plenty of other ways that we could go and measure people's intelligence of the work ethic. But for conformity, say there's a fundamental catch-22 in coming up with a new way to measure conformity. Namely, if you come up with a radical, innovative way of signaling conformity, who will be the first people in line to get that product? It'll be nonconformists. A conformist is not someone saying, isn't there an easier way that I could go and just slip through the cracks here? I don't feel like going and I'm going to do all this stuff. Conformist is someone who says, tell me the rules and I will comply with all the rules. So and I say this explains a lot of why the education system is just so stagnant. Why we're still teaching material from hundreds of years ago, even though a lot of it just is not very relevant to the, even less relevant than it ever was. So college used to basically be for preparing people for law, ministry, and medicine, right? And this is medicine back when you bled people to death, that kind of medicine, all right? And if you go and look at modern college, like the fingerprints of this old way of law, ministry, and medicine are still all over the curriculum, just the way that we do it. So, and but why is it that it's so hard to change? Why is there so little innovation? I say because a lot of this is just about sheer conformity. As long as you're complying with the traditional system, then you're showing that you're conformist, and people don't want to go and look around for something really weird. Or at least they're understandably nervous. That So I had another colleague 10 years ago saying, I'm getting really worried we're going to lose our jobs because of online education. It's so much cheaper. It can do our job so much better. And 10 years ago I said, relax, stop worrying. There's no problem. And I said because the first people who are in line like to go and do online education are not going to be the top students, and so there will be a stigma that will be attached to it. And what I told him is, 10 years from now, when your son's ready to go to college, are you going to let him go to an online college? And his reaction was, knee jerk. Right, knee jerk is, no son of mine's going to that, and exactly. And because a whole lot of other people are going to feel exactly the same way, our jobs are secure. And yes, year or so ago, his son went and started traditional four-year college, just as I had foretold. We're not employed, just as I had foretold.
Right. No, you mentioned something, and it's a really key element of this model and how it works, and that is that it's hard for employers to observe these characteristics directly in people. And it's the unobservability that creates the need for some kind of indirect signal.
That's right, because you just can't ask a person, so are you a really good worker? And it's like, oh yeah, super, really great. All right, if that's your hiring question, then everyone's just, if that's your hiring question, then everyone is just going to give the maximum answer. Like almost everyone. There'll be a few people who don't even understand that it helps them to lie or bend the truth. That's why, since you can't just look at a person and tell they're a good worker, you certainly can't just ask them and say, are you a good worker? Then you've got to figure out some other way of guessing the truth. And one of the things that is tragic about signaling is that these guesses are often wrong. On average, they're right. That's why people do it. But there's plenty of people who are really good workers who don't have the right degrees, and then they have trouble getting a good job. Right? It's not a fair system, but it's like employers aren't in the fairness business. They're not in the business of logical proof. They're in the business of making a tolerably good guess that allows the business to run.
And then it's also it's the fact that you've got to have more than just intelligence that creates this need for a signal, because intelligence is something you could probably measure relatively easily and much more quickly than, say, having somebody go to college for 4 years, spend 4 years in college, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, intelligence is something where you can get a very accurate measure with a test that's a few hours. But then the other stuff is a problem, because you might say, well, just have them see if they work hard for a day, and then we'll say they're hardworking. But the problem is if there's a lot at stake, if there's a great job at the end of the day, few people are so lazy that they won't work hard for one day. Right. And so that's why you've got to do more. Education, it's this war of attrition where you're just waiting for people to fall by the wayside. But here's what's really crucial is that, you might say, well, at least we could cut off a lot of years from the system by giving the intelligence test. But the problem is that in a system where it is conventional for people to do, say, a regular college degree, if you meet a person who's super smart but they didn't go to college, you don't just assume that they're average work ethic, average conformity. You figure quite reasonably they're probably way below average on those things, because a smart person finds it so easy to get through school. The fact that you're smart and didn't do it is a strong indication that you have a severe deficit in the other areas. So that's the problem.
You mentioned, because in your book you point, one of the objections that people raise to signaling is that, well, especially at the college level, it's so costly. You're talking about 4 years, tens of thousands of dollars in tuition in many cases. but it's really that cost that helps the signal work. That's what the theory shows us. It's the cost of the signal.
Yeah. So if college were really easy, then everyone would do it, and then it wouldn't show anything about you. So it's got to actually have attrition. Without attrition, there's no signal, right? So that's the problem. And although I would also add that, government at all levels subsidizes the college system by hundreds of billions of dollars per year. So part of the reason why you have to do so much is that it's become so affordable. And so the more affordable it is, again, in the human capital model, then people just go and get some subsidized skills and then they get good jobs. But in the signaling model, what happens is that the more subsidized it is, the more you need in order to convince employers that you're actually worthwhile. So signaling basically predicts what's called credential inflation, where the more education people have, the more education you need in order to get a job. So in other words, the education you need to do a job is constant, roughly, but the education you need to get a job keeps going up. And in the book I talk about research on this, and credential inflation has been massive over the last 70 years, almost a full degree. So again, of course, partly the labor market has changed, where we just have some more cognitively demanding jobs like computer programmer. But the main thing that's happened in the economy is that now, if you want to be a waiter at a fancy restaurant, you often need a college degree to get that job, which would have seemed insane in 1950. And it's not because the restaurant industry is so much more intellectually demanding than it used to be. In some ways, it's easier because you used to have to do math if you were a waiter. You used to have to add up the bill, and now you don't. So again, the real difference is that if a restaurant is trying to get workers of a certain quality level to work in the fancy restaurant, it makes sense for them to go and say, well, now that there's tons of people with college degrees floating around, maybe we should have a college degree requirement, or at least give a bonus, like give preferential hiring to people that have a college degree, even though, of course, no one goes to college to learn waitering.
Right. So another part of this, component of this would be to say, if employers need people who can learn certain skills or certain tasks on the job, then why couldn't, like colleges or high schools, why couldn't we have the schools teach more of the stuff that employers need to send people out to the job, ready?
Yeah, so the answer is they totally could. So then why don't they? A lot of it is it's a standard inefficient public sector system where teachers mostly just teach whatever they were taught, and their teachers taught them whatever they were taught. And the key thing is if going to school didn't raise your earnings at all and didn't serve the signaling function, then people wouldn't go anymore. But as long as it gives you good benefits, the fact that it could be better isn't enough to empty the classrooms by any means. And then once you get to a college campus, that's where you do actually have majors where you learn more useful vocational skills. You can do engineering and computer science, and you're wasting less of your time. However, those subjects are really hard, and there's a lot of students who don't feel like doing it. It's like, if I can either have 40 years of partying and get a job that raises my earnings by 40%, or I can have 4 years of misery and get a job that raises my earnings by 65%. That's where a lot of students will prefer to do the easy thing that raises their income only moderately rather than a lot. So, I mean, so that's the other thing going on, is that to some extent schools do offer choices of learning things that are more or less useful. But again, a lot of what signaling explains is all the other stuff, all the stuff that isn't useful. Why does that pay off? And again, once you've got that, then you can understand why a lot of people say, well, that's good enough. I don't want to kill myself here. Actually, it's just college. I don't want to get an education or anything.
So you talk a lot about, in much of your book, is about trying to go in and look at the relative contribution of signaling versus human capital. I mean, I guess a short version I always like to tell students is to how to explain that there is signaling. It's like they may well know a friend, or maybe they'll eventually do it. They complete their college degree, they go out, they land a job, and they get on the job, and the first thing the employer tells them is, forget everything you learned in school. We'll teach you what you need to know here. And I went to an engineering school, so I mean, people would say that, and which makes you really particularly wonder, like, well, why in the world did I have to spend 4 years studying this stuff if I'm not going to use any of it on the job? But employers, they sort of want to make sure they have somebody who can learn what they have to teach them, right?
Yeah, that's so much of it. There is a standard answer that people offer in defense of the status quo, which is, all right, well, you don't learn exactly or use exactly what you learn, but you learned how to think, you learned how to learn. And what I say in the book is that there's 100 years of research in educational psychology on this claim, saying that it's just wrong. right? And like there's very little evidence of people learning how to learn or learning how to think. Instead, the best case scenario for a teacher really is that they learn the material that you teach them. And often, of course, they don't even learn that. And really, so why is it? I mean, basically, it's just too hard. Learning how to learn is just too hard for most people to do. And I mean, like actual learning is more in the vein of training. And you think about this, you could, in principle, learn trigonometry and then use it to fly a plane. You could do it. All right, it's like, all right, well, the cosine of it, all right, but that's not how anyone learns to fly a plane. The way that people actually learn to fly a plane is get in the simulator so you don't kill people at first, and do a lot of practice in the simulator with someone who knows what they're doing, a real pilot giving you corrections and saying, good thing you're not in a real plane right now because you just killed us all, and get a lot of hours in that, and then finally get in a real plane and do it. And if you think that like your trigonometry is going to be of any real help, well, no. Like the way real humans learn is, learn by doing, learn by practice, and a lot of practice, and that's the thing that actually works. And like learning how to learn, it's mostly just wishful thinking, and it's sort of self-justification that professors offer and teachers offer for the in defense of the fact that what they're doing is obviously not relevant.
And the relevance or irrelevance of much of what's covered in school is, I guess, one of the things you point out is a strong argument as to why there must be signaling, because this is like the NFL Combine, and the NFL won't draft players until they've been in college for 3 years, and I mean clearly they don't care about
history.
In the NFL, they don't care about history. They don't care about trigonometry or any of this, and presumably since they have things like the combines where they can measure the player's skills directly, at one level you might say like, well, what's going on here? But there's some signaling here.
Yeah. So it does make sense that they're concerned about the work ethic or like team playerness of players. In the case of sports, I do wonder. Aren't there also agreements between the college leagues and the professional leagues where it used to be that it was more common for the professional leagues to poach students at younger ages, and then the college leagues went and negotiated with them, and they agreed to at least do less of that. So again, it may probably partly signaling, but then it may be this is a very unusual industry as well. So like that can be part of it too.
But there's so many clear cases where what's being taught in high school or college simply doesn't. People are never using those skills, so it can't be. And that's evidence against the human capital view, right?
Yeah, precisely. Like
human
French,
capital says
like high school French. Who in the world uses that?
Human capital is really saying it's what you were taught, what were in those books, what were in the classroom lessons that you're using, and is making you more productive.
Yeah. Or again, once you're back into a corner, then you start talking about learning how to learn, and then what's funny to me is I know so many economists who spend their whole careers laughing at psychologists, and then suddenly when you point out that the human capital model doesn't seem to make sense, then they become amateur psychologists and say, oh, well, there's learning how to learn. As psychologists have taught us, I've read what the psychologists would say about this. They don't say what you're saying. They say, actually, there's very little evidence of it. So now what do you say?
Another thing that you mentioned that is hard to square with the human capital view is the fact that, this is confirmed in this survey after study, people don't retain what they learn in college,
that's correct. Yeah, this is another amazing result in psychology. People forget stuff, especially if they forget stuff that they do not use. And so it doesn't make sense for employers to pay you for stuff you used to know.
Yeah.
They want to pay you for skills you currently possess. That's the whole point of having an employee. Like the fact, you're like, back in my day, I was great. Well, it's not your day anymore, Grandpa, so who cares? Right? But in the signaling model, it does make sense to care about people's performance on things that they've long since forgotten, because the fact that you learned it and forgot it still shows that you're capable of learning things. Still shows that you are willing to apply yourself, that you've got discipline, that you'll conform. And so, like in the human capital model, there's really no difference between failing a subject and forgetting it. But in the signaling model, there's a big difference, because failing it shows that you either couldn't or at least refused to learn the subject, and so you have got issues, whereas the fact that you learned it and then forgot it, that shows, all right, this is a person that we can work with.
There's another element of, when you look at the value of college, that doesn't comport well with the human capital model, and that's what you call the sheepskin effect, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on the exact timing of the payoff for education, and it seems like a large chunk comes from graduation. If you're going to school merely to acquire skills, this is quite puzzling. So do they wait until senior year to finally crack open the job skills and then start teaching them? In fact, if you've gone to any school in America that I've ever heard of, senior year is goof-off year. It's not finally learn some job skills year. And yet, it seems that this is the year that is most lucrative. So why would that be? human capital, I don't think it's any good story. But signaling model can say, well, since our society says that this is what is socially expected, only a nonconformist, or a nonconformist is much more likely to not finish, and so it is a crucial signal of conformity that you finish, and once you cross that threshold, then society says, here's a person who has complied with social expectations, this person is worthy of consideration for a highly paid job, where someone who hasn't quite finished, like, well, that's not what our society expects of you. And again, I say, this is the kind of insight that writing this book, I did feel more like a sociologist at the end, where it's like, well, what is socially expected does vary between societies. So in medieval Japan, if you wanted to get a good job, you probably wore a kimono, right? If you showed up today at a job interview with a kimono, people will think you're crazy, right? So it is very socially relative as to what the standards of conformity are. All I can say is in modern Western and especially American society, the key sign of conformity to social norms is precisely your degrees. This is the thing that will horrify your parents more than almost anything else. If you say, I'm not going to college, or I'm dropping out of high school, they're like, you are spitting in the face of everything our society holds dear, where there's a lot of other things that if you say, I don't want to get married, that's not as big of a deal anymore. It's no longer as deviant, but I don't want to go to college, horrors.
No, whether it's signaling or human capital is the correct model matters a lot for how we think about education and how we think about policy. And one of the things is you already mentioned this idea of credential inflation, and that comes out of signaling, and it's one of the ways in which signaling can become counterproductive or extra costly. Because it all go back to that. We said that the signal is really dependent on the cost, but if you have to incur extra costs, then that becomes problematic, right?
Yeah, like you said, so it's a war of attrition. So once you get college graduation rates up to a third of the young population, then if you want a job where you have to be in the top 10%, a bachelor's degree doesn't cut it anymore. You either have to go to a more elite school or a harder major, or, as you often do, start another program, get a master's degree, get a PhD, get a professional degree, right? So, and again, this is just the kind of thing we see. Even college professors, back in the 60s, you could be a professor with a master's degree. Oh my God, how could you teach Econ 1 when you've only got a master's degree? Right? It's just absurd, right? It's not really absurd in terms of ability to teach, but when there are PhDs floating around, then people naturally raise expectations. And so what we see here is, we can start off something like that on the left, where you've got a high school degree and that qualifies you for a good job. But once everybody else in the neighborhood is lighting up their house like that, then if you really want to get employers' eyes on you, if you want to impress, then you got to do something like this, where I've got master's degree, PhD. I think we both know people with like 2 PhDs. This kind of thing, where again, it seems crazy, but there's a point where people say, look, I just need to do this in order to be considered worthy of consideration.
And another implication is that you can't really, if there's signaling, you can't raise everybody up because there's a relative element of the signal that's just unavoidable.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, that's right, and that's actually why the main thing that I push in the book is cutting spending on education. I say that the reason why people have to spend so much of their life in school is because education is now so affordable, and if it were less affordable, a lot of people wouldn't be able to get it, but that's a feature, not a bug, because you also wouldn't need it anymore. So then people say, all right, well, I see the logic, but it's terrible that this would reduce opportunity for people. I say, think again, right? So if you're a high school dropout, would you rather be looking for a job today or in 1950? Clearly 1950, because the stigma against high school dropouts is just a lot less when there's a lot more of them. So again, the whole idea of credential inflation is precisely the more degrees people have, the more you need to be considered worthy of a good job. So I say, really, what we should be shooting for as a society is not a world where everyone goes to college. It should be a world where you can get a good job right out of high school. And it used to be possible, and there's no technological reason why it can't be possible again.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talk about this. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
Thanks again, Dan.